So we started a series just about 4 weeks ago that I'm calling The World of the Bible. And this could go a long time. You know me. I have no idea how long it'll go. But it's essentially talking about some of the ways, we'll never cover all of them because it's just way too much material, but some of the ways that the world of the Bible was different than our world is as 21st century Americans. And the differences are sometimes minor, but sometimes they're really big. Like there were some things that people did and said and thought back then that were completely the opposite of what you and I would say and do and think today, just because they came from a different background and had different issues that they dealt with and had just a different way that they were raised. And so one of those issues was looking at life as from the perspective of an individual, which is kind of what we do here in our nation, right? We're individually oriented versus cultures, and there are many in the world still today that are this way, that see things primarily from a group identity. But just let me, to touch on what I mean by individual identity, and definitely I've lived overseas, but I'm still very American in my outlook. I may not agree with what an individual might be doing, but I will defend their right to do it, as long as it's legal. You understand what I'm saying? If they want to be work in some job that I think is, man, what a waste of life. But I want them to be free to do that. That's the individual orientation. If they want to pursue their dreams, I may think that it's a foolish dream they're pursuing, but I want them to have the liberty to go after what speaks to them. And in our own lives, we see ourselves primarily as independent individuals. And so that's kind of where we come from. But the world of the Bible was different, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. And I want to begin by reading two verses that are a little bit unusual, and you're going to wonder, what does this have to do with a group identity? But we're going to explain it, and I think you'll see what I'm talking about. It's in Luke chapter 14. We'll read verses 25 and 26. Now great crowds accompanied him. Of course, that's talking about Jesus. And he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. So when you read that, it's disturbing to most people, right? That doesn't sound like something Jesus would have said. Jesus, loving, gentle, warm and accepting, the friend of sinners. And here he is talking about, hating your mother and father. But that is what he said. And I looked it up because just about every translation of the Bible uses that word hate, and I thought, I want to make sure for myself. So I looked it up in Greek, the language of the New Testament, and it is the Greek word miseo. And when you look it up in a Greek dictionary, that's exactly what it means. It's the word to hate. It doesn't mean anything else. Now, there are a lot of Christian pastors and Bible scholars and all they've kind of softened it. Well, Jesus couldn't really have meant that. So they say, well, what he really meant was that you should prefer one thing over the other. But if you look it up, and I spent a lot of time to make sure I didn't get this wrong, that's not the way ancient people used that word. In that time of history, that word meant one thing and one thing only. It meant to hate. So let me read it again, verse 26. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot mean my disciple. So the question, and it's a good question to ask, it's the obvious question, is this. Why would Jesus use a word like this, miseo, to hate? Why would he use a word like this to describe how you, as a Christian, as his follower, how you should feel toward your own family? And what's going to be surprising to you tonight, maybe you already know this, it's actually describing the way that ancient people were closely connected to their family and their larger community. And when you're trying to understand the Bible, this idea is important, because when you understand how people approached group identity back then, it actually helps you to explain a lot of things. So again, I already talked about this just a little bit, but in most Western culture, certainly typical American culture, we place a very high value on our freedom as individuals. And so we look at societies out there, countries out there, that don't protect individual freedoms, and we would usually, that's an oppressive nation, right? I remember, growing up and, the difference between, capitalist societies and communist societies. People, the communists, they don't protect freedoms, they're oppressive. And the reason that Americans have always felt this way is because it's kind of ingrained into us. In our minds as Americans, at least most of us, the ability to choose our own path is an essential right. And as I said already earlier, I may not agree with the path you're choosing, but I will defend your right to choose it. I do not want to force you to live in any other way than the way you choose, as long as it's legal, right? If you want to be an artist, if you want to be a carpenter, if you want to, whatever you want to do for a living, in my view, go for it. You should do it. But during the days of the Bible, the vast majority of people in the vast majority of societies saw things very differently. So in ancient cultures, and some of the world's still this way today, you as an individual would never choose where you live. You would never choose what you do for a living as far as a job. Your family would make those decisions for you. And most people didn't question that. That's how they were raised. That's how things were. That's just how ancient societies functioned. Your family decided, you're going to live here. This is what you're going to do for a living. So let me just give you one example, and you've heard about it, and it's, again, still practiced in some parts of the world. The practice of arranged marriages. In the ancient world, people simply assumed that a young person, talking early 20s, late teens, whatever, a young person without any life experience to speak of was not ready to make that kind of significant decision. It was simply taken for granted. They're not ready to choose their life partner. And so to get the best life partner, the best spouse for their situation, they needed the advice, and even more than advice, the direction of older, wiser members of the family. Now, if we tried that here in this nation, it wouldn't work, right? All the young people would have like a big heart attack, and no, that's not going to work. And in our generation, we wouldn't have wanted it either, right? I was very glad that I got to go out with Cheryl, and it was our choice, and my parents didn't arrange my marriage. But I want you to put yourself in the mindset of people back then, because there was actually some logic to it. And I'm going to get into quite a bit of detail here. Ancient cultures, again, as I've been saying, they were built around the group, not the individual. And that meant, and it's true to a degree in our nation, but not as much, it meant you weren't just marrying a person, you were marrying their family. Marrying their family. And so you needed to know, and I'll get into detail about this, you needed to know if these two families would make for a good fit, because those families were always going to be very closely connected. And why? So why? Why was that? Because in that day, people didn't get married and move away. Like, that happens now, right? You could get married, and you're 20 years old, you get married, and you're from Texas. You could move to the Northeast, you could move to California, you could move anywhere, you could move around the world. And it happens all the time. But back then, almost in every case, people got married and then they moved next door, literally, next door to other family members, and sometimes in the same house as their parents. They would get their own room in the house of the groom's parents. Now, why was that? And I want you to pay attention here because this is important understanding that there's a reasoning here, there's a logic here. In that day, if something went terribly wrong in your life, there was no social safety net. So, for example, if you lost your job, there were no unemployment benefits. Didn't exist. If you got really sick, and people back then did as they do today, if you got really sick and couldn't work, there was no health insurance. There were no hospitals that would take you in, at least nothing you would trust. And so families were their own safety net. Families had to take care of each other. And so that's why families stayed close to each other, either in the same house or at least on the same property. You would build a house next to your parents' house when you got married. That's where you would live with your family as they grew. And the reason, again, was your family was your security. If you had a significant problem, the people you turned to for help were your family. There were government structures, but they weren't like they are today in our nation. There was no Social Security Administration to go to for help when you got old. There just didn't exist, those things. And so that now, first of all, that helps you understand why most marriages were arranged. Because you got parents of a daughter. Now, in almost every case, the daughter went to her husband's family to live with them. But the parents of a young woman would be looking at that young man's family, and they wanted to know, if she goes there, is that a good family? Can we trust them to take care of her? Can we trust them to treat her right? Okay? So now, you understand now. I'm glad I didn't have an arranged marriage. I'm glad I'm married to Cheryl. But you get the logic, right? Because there just weren't safety nets out there in terms of society. And so the arranged marriage made sense from that perspective. You wanted to have the right family for your kids when they left your home. And then something else that you have to know about, the economy of most societies, and this is a little more detail, I've already talked about it a bit, didn't function like ours does today. So, for example, if I decided tomorrow that I wanted to move to Little Rock, Arkansas, what I would do, I could just move, and then I could go out knocking on doors, so to speak. I'm not moving. But, and look for a job, right? In my case, look for a church to pastor. But whatever you do, you could go, James could go find a college in Little Rock and get a job teaching there. But you didn't do that back in the ancient times. You didn't go out and find a job in a new city. Why? Because, number one, most business was farming. And those farms were family run. A father and his sons ran the family farm. But there were businesses too. But you know what? They were also family run. Why do you think Jesus was a carpenter? Because Joseph, his father, was a carpenter. And so businesses were family run. Sons were taught their trade by their father. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were fishermen. Their father taught them. And so sons were expected to work with their father in the family business. And then if the business did grow to where they had to hire someone, there weren't enough sons to do all the work, they would typically hire someone from their extended family, maybe a nephew, maybe a cousin. And if there wasn't somebody in the immediate family, they would always turn to people that they knew well from their community. Okay, we know this family, we know this young man, he's solid, he'll be the kind of person we want. And so everything was relationships, either family or very closely connected. Now, where did this all come from? Well, it goes back to the ancient days or the days of the ancient days of Israel's history. If you remember when Israel, the stories in the Bible, when Israel was first coming into the promised land and God was distributing it, telling Israel and the people how the land was going to be apportioned and divided up, God divided it by tribe, and he divided it by clan, and then the leaders divided it by families. And so each family was given its own farmland, except for the tribe of Levi, because they were in the service of worship. But every other family was given their own farm, their own piece of land, and they would work together to make it go well. Let me just read you just part of the passage. It's in Numbers 26, verses 55 and 56. But the land shall be divided by lot, according to the names of the tribes of their fathers they shall inherit. their inheritance shall be divided according to lot between the larger and the smaller. And I'm not going to keep reading it because it would take a long time, but it's an extended passage that talks about the land being divided, each tribe, and then by clan, and then clans by families. Now, as I was saying, you've got your piece of land now. You're just starting out, and if you wanted to succeed and do well, the family had to work together. Now, one man, assuming the kids were little, they can't work yet, one man could make enough of a go of it to at least feed his family if, and this is a big if everything went well. But there was no room for anything to go wrong. He couldn't get injured. He couldn't get sick because someone had to be out there taking care of the crops, taking care of the livestock, etc. And so if anything went wrong, he had a crisis. The only way for him to have continued the ability to work if there was a problem was if he had some sons who were being raised up and they were going to help him. So that's kind of where this idea came from, that ancient Israel was not centered on the individual. These were family farms originally, and if you wanted your farm to succeed, if you wanted it to grow and you wanted to thrive, you had to have your whole family working together. Everybody did their part. The women, the daughters, the wife, they played their part. And if one member wasn't doing their part, if one son was being a slacker or whatever, the entire family would suffer as a result. Everybody had to pitch in. And now, this also then, and I'm giving you a lot of background here, but this is important. This played into the way that Jewish people viewed their relationship with God. They understood something, that if they wanted to succeed, it wasn't just a matter of hard work. What had God been teaching them? That they needed his blessing. If they wanted to do well, they had to have his blessing. And so they felt the importance of doing the right thing spiritually as a family, worshiping together as a family, because that's how the family would be blessed, and they were family oriented. And if a family member did something to hinder that blessing, there were consequences. Because you're not doing right, son, and look what's happening to us. So there was pressure. Don't do the wrong thing. Now, as the years move ahead in Israel, that didn't change. Even though people were less and less living out on the farm, let's say, and they were moving more into towns, they always kept that family and community mentality. That never really changed. It was never about the individual. And this affected the early church. So you remember the stories in the New Testament, the Holy Spirit's being poured out, people are being saved. And if you know the stories of the New Testament, the Gospels and the book of Acts, the earliest Christians, the first people to become Christians, they were of a Jewish background. There weren't a lot of Gentiles living in the land of Judea, right? It was Jews, mostly, and it was Jews coming to faith. Now, here was the problem. In so many cases, when these Jewish people made a profession of faith in Jesus, that decision was not accepted by their family. Remember what I said? We serve God together as a family, and if somebody breaks it, the entire family is going to suffer. So all these people were coming to Jesus, and their families like, wait a minute, you are betraying the Jewish faith, you're betraying the God of Israel, which means you're betraying our family and what we believe, and our family could suffer because of what you're doing. You're going to bring God's judgment on us. Now, we know that's not true, but that's how people perceived it. So, somebody would come to faith in Jesus, right? Early stories of Christians, and their families looked at it, and they saw it as a betrayal. You have put God's blessing on our family in danger. Look what you've done to us. And so what would they do? Now, remember where the person lived. Either in their parents' home, right? Or in a home they had built on their parents' property next to their parents. The family would say, we don't want to be judged because of what you've done. You're out of the home. And where did most people work? In the family business. Either on the farm with dad, or if dad was a carpenter, you were a carpenter and you worked in the same carpentry shop. What have you done to us, son? You don't work here anymore. You lose your job. This happened a lot. That helps you to understand something in Acts chapter 2. This happens at the very beginning days of the church's existence. Acts 2, verses 44 and 45. It says, all who believed were together. This is talking about Christians, brand new Christians, early days of the church. All who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. Now, we read that and we put it in our context and think, wow, that's really generous, just that they felt led by the Spirit to help, and wow, we should do more of that today. And we should. We should. But in this case, it wasn't just something they were doing because it felt good or because they felt like they should do it. They were watching people coming to Jesus. And as a result, some of them were losing everything. Suddenly they're homeless, suddenly they're unemployed. And this was the church's way of stepping in and helping these new believers to start their lives again and to rebuild from nothing. Because again, that's how serious this issue was of leaving your family's faith. In the ancient world, your family and your community were everything. And if you did anything to hinder the success of your family or community, the consequences were serious. Your family would look at you and they say, you've betrayed us. You're bringing God's judgment on us because you've walked away from our faith. And they would just tell you, you're no longer part of the family. And they weren't doing it just because they were being mean. They were trying to protect themselves as a family from God's judgment because of what you did. There was logic to it. It was wrong, we would say, but it made sense to them. So now, I've given you all kinds of background. Let's go back to Luke 14, and I want to reread verses 25 and 26. This is what we started with, because now we can understand it. Great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Now you better understand what he was saying. Jesus wasn't demanding that his followers should literally hate their family. Because if there's one thing Jesus taught, and we all know it, it's that Christians should love everyone. That's part and parcel of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. But he was using some extreme language here as a way of showing people the cost of following him. Remember, Jesus lived in a world where family and community were everything. The majority of people did what their family expected without question. And Jesus is saying to them here, if you want to be my disciple, you should think about it. Don't just do it carelessly. Don't just do it on a whim. Sit down and consider and think about what's about to happen to you, what might happen to you. In fact, let's go to the very next verse, because Jesus adds some detail. Verse 27, for whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Now, watch verse 33. Therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. So again, Jesus wasn't telling people to literally hate their family, but he was telling them that following him might cost them family relationships and more. Might cost them their jobs, might cost them their security, might cost them their spouse, might cost them their relationship with their children. All those things get mentioned back in verse 26. So he's saying, before you choose to become my disciple, think about whether you're willing to pay that price. And remember, he's talking to people who valued family. In that time of history, family was everything. So this is part of the reason, we're almost done, and we'll have a discussion here, but this is kind of interesting. I remember growing up in the church world, we used brother and sister titles a lot. And as a kid especially, I didn't call somebody by their first name. I called them Brother Smith, Sister Jones, right? And I always thought it was a title of respect, right? But in the early church, that wasn't what it was. In the early church, the reason they used the titles brother and sister was because, again, some people had given up everything to become Christians, and their families had rejected them And so in Acts 2, for example, you have all these brand new Christians, and so many of them were being rejected by their families because of their faith, that the church had to step in and help them start over, and the church became their new family. The church became their new, listen, brothers and sisters. Wasn't the title of respect, Brother Bretches. It was Jeff, my brother. B, my sister. The church is my family. The church has become the place where I get the love and support that I used to get from my family, who no longer wants anything to do with me because of Jesus. And the church, brothers and sisters, became the place where they were safe because they were tied together with their fellow believers through the blood of Jesus. Group identity, individual identity. I'm not arguing for one or the other. I'm not saying that they were right and we're wrong. We're just different. I'm simply saying when you understand it, the Bible begins to make more sense, especially verses like this one where Jesus talks about hating your family. That's not what he was saying. But he was saying, count the cost, because the effect of serving me could be as if your family hated you or you hated them. Be willing to count that and to think about that when you make a decision to serve Jesus.